I was, doing some revisiting books and things on this, and something about feedback I really wanted to call out specifically in the context of Harvest is that, all of us are really into, take the semantic you want, but person-centered care, which comes from the person-centered psychotherapy tradition of Carl Rogers is sort of where all that's rooted in, and all of that is a bunch of jargon. It doesn't really matter. And what really matters is that we all believe that given the right conditions, people will grow towards wholeness. They're already whole, and we're continuing to unfold into bigger and bigger encompassing layers of wholeness. And that's sort of what underpins, what I know underpins the philosophy of how Harvest sees their clients and how Harvest sees their employees, is that we are all whole beings who, given the right conditions, will continue to grow in that wholeness, that there's nothing deficient or broken or wrong about any of us. And it's just about how can we show up for people in that way. And so when I was reviewing feedback stuff, feedback is a really important part of person-centered psychotherapy, and then by proxy, person-centered care, in that in order to grow, a really crucial part of that is awareness. The first step to growth is awareness. And one of the best ways to be aware is through feedback, getting that perspective from someone else. And so I really want to offer that as framing as we're thinking about feedback today, that feedback is not about you're doing something wrong in my perspective and I'm going to tell you how to do it right. That would be teaching someone to grow through like criticism. And what happens when we criticize is that then the person who's criticizing you becomes a necessary part of your growth in a codependent relationship. You have to seek them out to see where your limits are in your critique, and then it's not coming from you anymore. And actually, the same thing can happen when we use praise only. And so when we're talking about feedback today, I want you all to think about it as like fertilizer for growth and extra bonuses of awareness, and how it really is integral to the kind of care that I know you all are really committed to being in partnership with your clients, and the way you want to support each other as individuals. So I want to sort of offer that as framing before we dive in, especially if anybody had any anxiety around, am I going to be told all the things I'm doing wrong today? And with that, I'll pass it back over to Steph.
Thanks, Kyrie. That was a beautiful introduction. And I'll just do a little bit of a double click on what we mean by feedback and what we're going to be discussing today. So I think Kyrie and I both believe that feedback is one of the most skillful ways to actually build the relationship and to build trust when it's done well. And probably everyone on this call also knows that feedback can trigger a lot of discomfort and a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety, especially when it's not practiced regularly or when a group of us don't have a common language around it. Like feedback can be really scary, both on the giving and the receiving side. And yet, in reality, I think all of us also know that feedback is actually happening all the time, whether we're saying it aloud or not. So we get feedback and give feedback through body language. We give it and get it through our facial expressions or our tone of voice. And that in the absence of actually sharing direct feedback, of vocalizing it, often we, because we're human, tend to make up stories or narratives about what the deeper meaning of the feedback we're getting is. You know, you give me a certain look and I make up a story about what you're trying to say to me. And that often that story is inaccurate for what's actually going on, which is really one of the reasons why direct vocalized feedback is so important. We'd like to start by specifying that before we can actually give feedback to others, it's really important that we get clear on where we're coming from and what our current perspective is in the moment, so that we can give accurate feedback to someone else. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Kyrie, who's going to get us a little clear on where we are right now.
Yeah, thanks, Steph. So yeah, a perspective. So when we're giving feedback, by nature of it is something, we're observing something, we're experiencing something, and we're experiencing it through our own lens, through our perspective. And I want to offer the definition of a perspective as a view from one point. And that is just one angle. So then the more perspectives you can get, the more views from different points you can get, and a better picture that will get developed. And our perspective is really shaped by the world that we live in, the life that we've lived, and each one of us has come down a really different path to be in this Zoom room today. And so before we can start giving feedback, it's really important to get present with our own cat. And so other than Sean, if you're still driving, do not close your eyes. But everybody
No, I'm not
else,
driving. Just trying to find somewhere inside.
Perfect. So for everyone else, I want us to just do a brief reflection on our individual journeys that got us here in the room today, to really honor our own perspective, you know, and also thinking about a bit of the implicit biases and things that come in with that, but just grounding in our perspective before we move forward. So if you will, please find a comfortable seat if possible, and put your feet on the floor. And if it feels comfortable to you, I encourage you to close your eyes. And let's take, we're gonna take a breath together. We're gonna take one deep breath in and let it out with a sigh. And we're gonna do that 2 more times. Deep breath in. Now just let your breathing return to normal, keeping your eyes closed. Reflect on how you came to be in whatever city you're sitting in, to be in the room that you're sitting in. Reflect on how you ended up on this call today. What abilities or characteristics have made it easier or more challenging for you to get to where you are today? Take a moment to reflect on how many times you've orbited the sun riding on this planet Earth. Reflect on who came before you, your ancestors. How have they shaped how you see the world? How have they shaped how the world sees you? Reflect on your access to education or other resources and the role that that has played in your story. Reflect on the body you're in and how you move through the world in it, how people respond to it, how you feel about it. Reflect on who you love and how that has shaped you. Look back across your story and your identity. Know that with everyone else sitting with themselves right now, there will be common threads for each of us. Some of our answers to the above reflections would be the same. Some will be different. No 2 stories are exactly alike. Take a moment and honor your unique story and the gift of being in this space with so many other unique stories. When you're ready, blink your eyes open and come back to our communal space. I'd love to hear from someone. I muted you all during that, so you'll have to unmute yourself, but I'd love to hear from someone. How was that for you? What was that like?
It was peaceful.
Peaceful?
Just nice to
What, yeah, for any of you, what stood out to you during that reflection?
The fact that I can't remember the last time I had the mental clarity to even think about something outside of current events.
Yeah, the COVID-free reflection.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah. Definitely.
Okay.
it was very grounding and calming.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Made me think about things that I don't always have the time or energy to think of.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're so
Yeah.
good at that. You're so relaxing.
I was
Can
going
we
to ask where you came up with the sequence of questions.
can we just do more of
It's,
that?
it's the address. Haven,
Yeah.
it's the addressing model.
Oh, we did.
it.
That's so funny. Good
Under
job.
the hood there. Yeah,
Yeah.
so those were all diversity factors. And so this really was a reflection on that, on our identity. And, while we all shared that experience together and we all might feel relaxed, we each had a really distinct experience. And that is what's so important. And that's where the juice is a shared yet distinct experience. And the sum, again, of those points of views. And so I just want you to hold this reflection with you as we move forward, and just be aware of how your story might be showing up as you give and receive feedback in the future. And with that, Steph is going to take us through to starting a little bit more context setting around this, and then we're going to get into the action of it.
I don't know if I can facilitate anymore. I just did that reflection. It was so nice. Thank you, Kiri. Brought me way back and way forward.
We can do meditation in our coaching sessions too, everyone. If you just need a minute to chill, you can make a session with me and we can just do that.
Yes. All right. So we've obviously just had a chance to get present with ourselves. And we've thought a little bit about where we've come from. So next we'd like to have an experience of getting present with each other, with this group. And so one point I want to make is that the best feedback really comes from being able to speak to the impact of an action or a behavior on you. That we give feedback based on the impact of someone else's action or behavior. But in order to be able to speak to that impact, we actually need to first be able to name where we are and how we feel, so that we can know how it's changed based on someone's behavior and action, right? We actually need to have awareness of where we are. So in other words, we need to start from a place of knowing our baseline. The other important piece of this is that when we authentically share what we're doing with others, when we get on the same page with how we're doing, we of course are practicing openness and building trust. So with that, I'm going to just ask you to take a minute and reflect on, in this moment, how are you doing mentally, emotionally, and physically? And just choose one word for each of those. So again, it's just one word for how are you doing mentally, one word for how you're doing emotionally, one word for how you're doing physically. And sometimes it's nice to just pick whatever the very first word that pops into your head is. That part of doing this check-in is you actually know where people are, and if someone's mentally, physically, and emotionally drained, maybe it's not a great moment to give them feedback about how they're really struggling with something or whatever. And so literally with that one word, we can actually learn a lot about, yes, where the group is, but also sort of where individuals are in terms of how we're relating to them. If you're human, you probably experience some anxiety around both giving and receiving feedback. Like, it's something that we naturally assume is going to be uncomfortable. And why? Why is that? Especially, I would note, why is that when, like, in corporate speak, we also hear feedback is a gift, like feedback is so important in organizations, you should really be giving and getting feedback all the time. But we feel terrible about it when we hear the word feedback. So why that discrepancy? It's because emotions like anxiety, fear, shame drive self-protection, right? They begin and often come from this belief that, one, like, I'm not enough, I'm imperfect, I've done something wrong, I don't know how to give feedback, I'm going to respond incorrectly, right? So there's this deep fear that something is wrong with us, essentially. That's what anxiety and shame are often really bringing up in us. which then can cause us to self-protect. So the pattern might go, essentially, I'm experiencing shame. I've done something wrong. Now I need to protect myself. Because if I'm honest, if I'm honest about feeling shame, if I'm honest about feeling anxiety, I might appear weak, or I might actually do something wrong, or they'll think less of me, right? Like we both have a self-protection response when we think we're going to get feedback, but then we also actually don't want to be vulnerable in the midst of giving feedback. Like, so there's essentially all this self-protection going on, which really makes us less vulnerable, and also often leads to dishonesty. Like, I'm not going to share with you. So sometimes, we might get feedback and just say thank you, right? Like, shut it down. I can't engage with this. Or we might not give feedback because we're so worried about not doing it correctly that, again, we self-protect. We say, like, I can't do this. I'm not going to do this. We shut it down. So we don't take that step to put ourselves out there. And then what can often happen, especially if we're the one who's afraid of receiving feedback, is we turn it around on the other person. So we get into the mode of, this person wants to give me feedback, like, I'm going to figure out their fault first before they can tell me that I've done something wrong. So like, it goes beyond like, I'm self-protecting to actually it's their fault. And of course, we're no longer in a relationship when that happens. Like, there's so much fear, anxiety, shame, and blame happening, that the end result is that no one's sharing, no one gets heard, and no one grows. Does that sound familiar, that sort of cycle of thoughts and confusion and anxiety around feedback? I know it does for me.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You articulated that really well.
Yeah. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge this, right? As managers, if we're framing feedback to our team, with each other, when we're talking about it, that we acknowledge giving and receiving feedback is really vulnerable. It's hard. And there's this underlying dynamic of feelings like shame, anxiety, fear that can come up. So let's just acknowledge them and acknowledge that feedback is a vulnerable, it's a vulnerable experience on both sides. And we do believe that feedback is crucial. So why is it that feedback is a gift? Why is it that we need to give feedback? Because, and Kyrie so beautifully framed us up at the beginning around this, feedback is what actually leads to growth, right? Feedback is what enables us to see not just from our point of view, but from multiple points of view. And that if we want to be masters at something, if we want to gain mastery and get better, we actually need feedback. We don't become masters without feedback. So it's so cool to think, if I want to be an expert in what I do in any area of my life, the best way to do that is to get feedback from multiple points of view. So again, when we reframe feedback as, if I want to achieve mastery, this is discomfort that I'm going to have to go through, and it may bring up these uncomfortable feelings, but ultimately it's about my growth and about me getting better at something that I care about. It can help us to, I think, open up to the experience of feedback. And a final note that I'll put on this is, what really makes giving and receiving feedback easier is, yes, that reframe, but also practice, right? The more we practice something, the easier it becomes. And the more we have a shared understanding and common language around something, the easier it becomes. So we're not going to ask you to give feedback yet, but we are going to go into a cool exercise where you'll get to go into breakout rooms really based around that framing. So Kyrie, go for it.
Yes. All right. So we are, before we dive right into growth generative feedback, we're going to come up with some principles to share together about giving feedback, because you all are a unique group too. And so what I would love for you to do is, you just had both. It's funny actually, because in person, when I do you're going to pair up, everyone automatically felt, you could just feel the anxiety in the room rise. And it's funny, the like difference in on video, we'll have to make that a little more drastic feeling next time. But you pretended to have the experience of feeling like what it was to jump into feedback too soon. So we're going to co-create some principles together for giving feedback. And what I want you to do is take just a moment and think about a time when you received feedback. It doesn't have to be at work. This can be feedback from a kid, from a parent, from a friend. So just think of whatever the first one that comes to mind. Surface in your mind a time when you received feedback. Someone gave you feedback. Think about what you remember about it, how it was given, how you responded in the moment, what worked and what didn't. And then I want to invite someone to maybe like share, really, try to share it in just a couple sentences, what's coming up for them and sort of their answers to these questions. And as they do, use the chat box to think about principles that will help us when we're receiving feedback. Like, what do we need to make sure? What are our ground rules for receiving feedback to have it be generative? So be thinking about that. But who wants to share a time when they received feedback? It can be one that worked well or didn't work well. Both are fine to serve as principles. There's an anecdote popping up.
I have a lot, but I talk all the time.
I know, so do I. I'm just holding back. Somebody else has to
Well,
go.
I'm willing to share. There's been several instances in the past where I've communicated on Slack in a more direct and sensitive way. And Kaylee has given me some great feedback, some good mentoring about a better way of communicating, because sometimes when you're texting or messaging, it can come off as I don't know, rude or insensitive. Sometimes using emojis like a smiley face can help, and it really depends on who you're talking to. But sometimes just rephrasing, and I think it just takes practice. And every time when I'm like typing something or like thinking about some kind of feedback to give one of our care partners, I always think, would Kaylee approve of this? Well, I shouldn't say approve of this, but would she agree, or is this something like Kaylee would say? So yeah,
it's a good
Great.
filter.
And so what worked about the way, so it sounds like, I'm hearing too, it's less about Kaylee criticizing you, more about you respect the way she gave you feedback and it worked, and so you want to carry that forward. So what worked about the way that she gave you feedback? What made you be able to hear it? What made it work?
It was kind. It was instead of saying, well, you did this wrong, Sarah, it was try this instead, or I understand your points, but let's try wording it that way. And I think it just took exposure and experience with, sometimes I'm not sure what words to use or which way to emphasize it. And so sometimes I just need to learn to articulate a little bit better. So yeah.
If I could really quick, just since I was mentioned in that, I have to say that like my, just being able to give feedback to Sarah, like her response makes it much easier also to offer feedback. Like just, it's, not everybody responds really well. And sometimes I have to redo how I even want to give feedback and offer it based off of how they might normally respond. And so it's just always really nice knowing when I'm going into a situation that like, okay, I know that this is going to be a constructive conversation. So I want to, that's kudos to Sarah too, just knowing that like she's someone who will take feedback from my experience with her. So that helps too.
Yeah. Well, I understand
many other people.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes it's hard to like, oh, I did that wrong. Like, to be honest, sometimes I disagree. Like I'm like, well, this is the way I would handle it, but it's not the best way of handling it. So I also understand that. So of course it's hard to hear that criticism, but it's more, I'm learning. So that's the way I always look at it.
Perfect. That is a perfect example. And Sarah, I love what you said too, we don't always have to agree with the feedback to take it in, because again, it's a view from one point, And you can hold both that point of view and your point of view and let them be in conversation with each other. And I love that you brought that up. It's about having that curiosity. Well, how does Kaylee see it? Okay, what do I think about how Kaylee sees it? And that's going to help that feedback to actually be generous. Maybe I agree with it, maybe I don't. Then there's a conversation there. I love the kindness that you mentioned too. Great. Yeah, so when anything else that feels like wants to be shared? Or I feel like that was a really great example of feedback working. Anything anyone wants to share on that?
I mean, I've been in a few positions over the years where I have received feedback, both good and bad. And there's one that stays with me often, unfortunately, because it was bad. But I was quite young, and I was managing a hotel at the time, and I was kind of the last one standing and left into training all new people, new building, new program, new people. And I really had no clue about so many things. I really didn't, but I was just doing what I could. And the new CEO, the new manager, the new head CEO, I don't think she liked me overall, but I just kept getting pulled in, and the way that I would get feedback it was very shameful. Like, I felt very ashamed every time I went in there. I felt like I was doing everything I thought I knew. Instead of her offering like tools or suggestions, it was just like, you think you should have figured this out by now, or just what's do you think you really should be here? It was hard, and I was young, so I didn't have some of my mature answers prepared at that time. So that was definitely a big problem. But I felt she was older, and I could have been a great mentor, and I think she missed some great opportunities in installing some stuff in me. Instead, I ended up just leaving. I ended up quitting the first time ever that I think I've ever quit a job. I quit that job because I felt worthless. I felt belittled. I felt like I didn't know what else to do. That was really hard.
Sounds like we know where you learned to be kind and giving your feedback.
Yeah, I didn't want to do that way to anybody.
Thank you, Kaylee. That's a great story. Steph, will you put up the slide we have, but keep it in, don't put in full presentation mode. Let's add in kindness. I love that. So we pulled up some principles for giving feedback, and I'd love you all to look at this and see, based on your reflection that you had, if there's anything you feel like is missing. So I'm noticing and listening to you all, a new thing I feel like you surfaced as a Harvest principle was kindness. And giving that feedback. But some other things we want to make sure to highlight is having a growth mindset. So knowing that growth requires feedback. And growth mindset is the opposite of a fixed mindset. So it's being willing to change what you think. So Sarah, you highlighted that so well in that, like, sometimes I don't agree with Kaylee, but that didn't mean you rejected the feedback. That would be a fixed mindset. It also doesn't mean that you just take whatever Kaylee says as gold. You take it as something, you integrate it with what you already know, and you grow from it. Presence, staying present in the growth itself, that's really being aware of where you are and following your own process. Sarah, you did a really good job also saying being brave enough to listen. I thought your story highlighted that well, of like not doing what we were talking about earlier, not shutting down. And it sounds like Kaylee's kindness helped you to not get defensive. And then, yeah, and grace too. And, Kaylee, in your story, it sounds like you gave your old boss a lot of grace of like, hey, like this really could have been done better. You were really trying to meet them there.
I didn't know how to stand.
Yeah, and then curiosity. So that is like when, so like in your example too of like, let's say you don't agree with what Kaylee says, then like continuing to ask about it and learn more about it and understand it more completely. And then something too, Kaylee, you highlighted this self-care. You quit because that wasn't okay for you, and and that was a really drastic form of self-care. So it sounds like that was a pretty drastic situation. So self-care can also look like saying like, oh, you know what? I've had a really long day. I know I'm not in a space to hear this. Can we have this conversation tomorrow? Would be a really good form of self-care. Is there anything else that's missing from this list, Harvest, from your reflections you had that you feel like you want to get up there as your principles for receiving feedback?
I think the time aspect of self-care is extremely important. I
Yeah.
think it's good that it gives you a lot of perspective. A lot of times when I'll get feedback initially, my self-protection will be in full force initially. And, you know, there'll be some asks and I'll just, you know, mentally say, no, I'm not going to do that. And then when I come back, everything looks a lot less dire, a lot less important. And I understand what's being said a lot more.
So important. Yeah.
Thank you, Jenna.
What about like withholding judgment? I think you might have discussed that. Never mind.
Is that in there?
No, I think that's great. Yeah, I think that goes right in Grace. But yeah, really good call out, Sarah.
Okay.
Super important. Anything else you feel like missing, or do you want to, you know, kind of reiterate?
Tied to kindness, I think you can ground yourself in gratitude, you know, regardless of as part of leaning into accepting the opportunity to have a different perspective, whether you agree with it or not. Just as gratitude, it can ground you to kind of see things more from your heart in many different, you know, different circumstances you can be in. I think getting feedback and being grateful for it, again, whether you like it or not, take it or not, I think gratitude is a good place to keep centered.
Yeah, I like that.
Is that you, Kaylee, trying to, or is that, no, Kately is trying to get in. Are we waiting for a Kately? No? Okay, I'm going to leave them in the waiting room then.
Unless someone's
great.
on a new device, like did someone have to? No, everybody's there. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. We're gonna leave them there. Maybe it's a Zoom bomber. So I really encourage you to, if you know you're gonna, like in the exchange that got brought up earlier, if you know you're about to be in a feedback situation and we'll send these out to you, like read these before you enter into that meeting where you know you're gonna get feedback. If you somehow know that it's coming, it's a really great to be like, oh yeah, this is the place that I'm in, ground in that, so you can be open and receptive to the feedback. And with that, we're gonna flip the script from receiving to giving. And Steph's gonna walk us through that. You're muted, Steph.
Mute, unmute. So same deal. I'm going to give you a minute to think about a time when you gave feedback. Again, this could be professional or it could be to a spouse or a family member. I know I have a lot of those top of mind right now. What do you remember about it? How was the feedback given? How did you give it, gracefully or not? How did they respond in the moment? So what worked and what didn't about giving feedback? All right, round two. Is anyone willing to share an anecdote and what worked and what didn't, or what it looked like?
First, I do want to say, by the way, I just have to put this out there that because I give feedback to these guys all the time, good and bad or whatever it is, and they're such troopers. I have to say that really quick.
I don't know, Kaylee. It sounds like you're really exhausting everybody.
I know. I think I'm killing everyone.
That's
No,
all Katie's
so
fault.
I just really think that they are really good at taking it and being honest too. So it's really good. But I do have some other things I can share, but I want to open it up for someone else first.
Anybody have examples of giving feedback to some of our care partners?
Our clients,
That's
family members.
Mary
I
Beth?
feel like something
And
that doesn't work if you come off too strong and too, let's see, disrespectful, and not understanding where they're coming from their feedback to you, and then you give feedback to them. Just make sure you don't do it in an angry kind of way, or maybe understand them a little more than what you know of them. I don't know if that makes sense. Because
Yeah.
I've given feedback where I've given it from my own personal self, and I've actually ruined relationships because I didn't understand them and how they're coming at me, and then I guess I didn't respect them at the moment and try to get to know them a little more and understand them. So I definitely think understanding someone and understand their story, where they're coming from, and just listening, in which I am trying to learn more of, is just listen to others. So definitely just listen and understand.
I love that, Mary Beth. I mean, really what you're pointing to is a number of things, but we hold all people with dignity, right? We give people respect, and also that we avoid making assumptions. And I think so often when we're giving feedback, it can come from a place of having an assumption about, someone's motivation or someone's, the story we have made up about what the feedback they're giving, or what the feedback we're giving is about, and often we're wrong about that story.
Yeah, definitely. Been there.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a big difference for me between giving feedback on a situation or scenario in which I'm not personally entangled. There's a difference between that and me giving feedback on a situation in which, if I'm threatened in any way, like if I perceive being personally threatened, all skills, everything, I feel like every skill ability that I have to handle it skillfully goes completely out the window, and it's like knives out, and things go south. And my reflection was, and it never works when that happens. It's never effective at all.
The last time
oh, sorry, go ahead, Sean.
No, it's okay. Go ahead, Mary Beth. I'll go afterwards.
Like for me, I tell everybody, please give me feedback. Tell me like what I'm doing wrong. I want to know. And there was a time where I was at assessment, and I do talk really fast, which I'm probably doing now. One of our clients I was doing assessment with just asked me to slow down, and I'm like, well, I don't know how to slow down. And this was a couple years ago. And at first I kind of took it the wrong way. I'm like, I guess I don't want to talk to me or want to hear me explain to them what we're doing in our company. But I'm still learning through the years to slow down, which I know I haven't, because I just talk fast. That's just me, my personality. I talk fast. So I'm trying to learn it myself, but also understand where they're coming from, because a lot of people just misunderstand what I say, and I took it to a grain of salt, and like I got a little hurt about it. But I'm realizing that I do need to slow down and listen to them instead of just not understanding their feedback, instead of taking it to a assault or getting upset. I'm trying to learn as well.
Mary Beth, you just nailed another thing that we're going to cover shortly, which is on both sides, checking for understanding, and how infrequently we do that when we're giving feedback, and how infrequently we do that when we're receiving feedback. Is that first point around coming from a place of grace, that none of us do this perfectly, and it's messy, and that's okay. But that one way we can get better is to check for understanding, and to see, do we at least hear each other? Again, even if we don't agree, do we understand what the other person is trying to say? So I'm going to just briefly—
Sean, did you want to say something really quick? I'm sorry, I didn't want to cut.
That's
I
right.
wanted him to have that opportunity.
Oh, I guess I was just going to say, last time I found myself in a position to give feedback to someone, I definitely let my emotions control too much of the feedback, and I didn't stay calm while I was doing it. And reflexively, I see how it's actually, I think it gets damaging trying to give feedback if you're too caught up in a particular emotion. So yeah, next time I'll just want to try to remember to calm down a little bit first before I give feedback, because I don't think feedback can be constructive if you're in a really heightened emotional state.
Yeah. Yeah, that time that Jonas was talking about earlier, so important.
Yes. Yeah, and actually goes back to the just 3-word check-in that we did earlier. You know, both Kyrie's brief meditation and the 3-word check-in, you know, you can do that on your own. And if you check in with yourself and realize that you're just in a crappy place, probably not a great moment to give feedback.
Yeah.
You know, until you feel like you have a little bit more capacity.
Yeah.
So I do want to make sure we have time for our last and juiciest exercise. So I'm just going to briefly review some of the feedback principles that we've really already touched on through your stories. But the first one that I love is just thinking about giving feedback in partnership. And you can use this in framing before you give feedback if you know someone might be a little defensive, which is, you know, I'm sitting next to you and I want us to think about this as a problem that's in front of us, sitting next to each other, rather than something that's between us.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, I know. I love this one. I don't know where we got it, but
Wow.
I was going to ask.
Yeah.
It's really nice.
It might be a Brene Brown. I don't know.
Kyrie, some psychology book. Yeah, and I'm like, which one?
I'll just take credit.
Yeah.
Actually, I think
Brene Brown, Buddhism.
didn't I give this to you, Kyrie?
Didn't
this come from Bill?
But in thinking about some of my own experiences with feedback, there have been a few times when I think a manager has framed it in this way, and it is so incredibly helpful.
No kidding.
The second piece, right? Curiosity on both sides. You're both listening, you're both asking questions, you're checking to fully understand. Ownership with giving feedback. So, you know, making sure that you're open to owning your part if someone has a response, or even in the framing of the feedback, just acknowledging what your part is within the dynamic. Empathetic accountability. This is something that Kyrie and I made up, but that it's possible to hold someone accountable because you believe in their capacity for growth without shaming or blaming them.
I love that.
Yeah, you know, that accountability is different than blame.
Yeah.
And then finally, vulnerability, you know, which just by simply deciding that you're going to give feedback, you're demonstrating, but, you know, thinking about how to model the vulnerability that you'd like to see from someone when they receive it. And sometimes, you know, Sean, it's interesting to your point around sort of calming down and being in control of your emotions before giving feedback, which I think in general is a very useful principle. At other times, I think vulnerability can be sharing maybe what those feelings were, you know, depending on the situation. Even if you're not super angry, sometimes it's important to let someone know, you know, the impact of something that happened was that I was really angry. So there's a difference, I think, between speaking from a place of total upset where you're not present, but also later on being able to point to emotions that were coming up for you, speaking from a place of vulnerability. So with that, Kyrie.
Yeah, so with that, we're actually going to do, now that we're all in this like really yummy open-hearted space, we are actually going to give you the experience of practicing feedback. We are going to frame it as appreciative feedback today. So you are going to get put into pairs and you're going to get a chance to practice. And this is the flow that we want you to use for practicing. I'm also popping this into the chat box so that you have it once you go into your breakout. You'll be able to see those steps there as the giver and receiver. And what I want you to do when you go into your room is think about something that you appreciate about the other person you're in the room with. One of you will be in a room with Stephanie, and so just come up with something for both of you, both Stephanie, an experience with the person here, and the person who's paired with her, an experience
I feel like
of
you
this call today.
I think you should put yourself in a room because you have an actual relationship.
I don't know how to do that. I guess I can go, if you don't go in your room, I'll go in your room.
Yeah, you can jump in.
Then I'll go like visit it. Yeah. I couldn't figure out how to put myself in one. Okay. Then there, I'll do that. I definitely have lots of appreciation for all of you. So this is a little bit of a flow that we want to offer for when you give feedback. And so as the giver, we want you to lead with intent and consent. And so what that might look like is, let's say I was giving Stephanie feedback. I was like, hey, Steph, I have some feedback for you, and my hope is that it'll help you to continue to develop as a facilitator. Is now a good time for me to give it to you? And she might say,
yes, or
right, so
no.
I said why I wanted to,
Yeah.
yes or no, right.
Or can you give it at the end of the day? That's when I have more capacity to listen.
Exactly. So I led with my intent of why I wanted to give this feedback so that she knows where I'm coming from. And then I also got her consent. And so, you know, consent is so important. And a lack of someone saying, I think just like with sexual consent, a lack of someone saying no isn't consent. You need to get that yes. You need to get that yeah. This is an okay time for me to be vulnerable, for me to be open, to start that conversation. Then as I'm giving the feedback, I'm going to speak from I statements. I'm not going to, and that means that and that doesn't mean I'm going to say, I feel like you always do this because this is how you are. You can't just put I in front of whatever sentence you wanted to say. It's really talking about my experience and the impact that had on me. And when you speak, you're also going to, the best feedback focuses on observable and specific actions and behaviors. That's the easiest way. That meditation we did in the beginning where we thought about the lens that we're looking through the world in, it's really easy for our biases to crop in feedback and for us to make judgment calls. And it's going to happen, and that's okay. But the way to help balance that is to make sure that things are really specific and observable. So I might say to Stephanie, like, wow, you know, on this call today, I really appreciated when we were initially doing the fake out feedback session. There was a moment where you called out that it maybe hadn't been quite as deep in a really gentle way where, and yeah, what you said something to the effect of, or if that was the way you felt, go ahead and imagine it. And I really appreciated when you jumped in right there and what you said. And then you're going to name the impact too. And the impact for me was, it made me feel like I have a really good partner in these facilitations, and I didn't feel shamed for messing something up or forgetting something. It made me feel like, yeah, we were in a real partnership. You felt the experience as a participant and gave that experience back. And then after I do that, I'm going to check for clarity. Does that make sense? Do you have any questions about what my experience was like?
That makes sense. You felt like I gently offered an alternative. So no, I don't have any questions about it. Thanks for asking.
And so you'll notice I did speak about her, but I tried to speak about a specific observable thing that all of you saw, not my interpretation. I didn't say, you decided I was wrong and you jumped in there and you did this thing, or you decided I needed rescuing. It was more about my experience. And you can see Stephanie followed the other ones, and she reflected back what I said. She spoke from I. She didn't have any clarifying questions. And she shared what she needed.